Welcome to Wendy Wren Builds a Home. Wendy is a small bird, but she has a very loud and pretty singing voice, and she sings from the heart. It was a bright sunny day and Wendy Wren was busy with her housekeeping. She had lots to do because something very special was going to happen and she knew that this was her last chance to make everything just right. She was working very hard to make the new home nice and soft. Wendy's house was a very special house and very, very interesting. The house was built in one of Farmer Jones's many trees. But this tree was special. Years ago, Farmer Jones's son, Billy, climbed up the tree and nailed some boards across a few branches where he could sit and watch the birds, squirrels, and rabbits having fun running around on the farm. He also built a small wooden box and nailed it to the boards to keep his toys. But now, the sturdy little box was empty. So, Wendy and her husband, Ren Tin, decided to build their home inside of the box where they would be safe if it rained. So Wendy and Ren Tin collected straw, and twigs, and dried up leaves. They built their little house together, because they knew that soon they would have a wonderful surprise coming to them. Wendy and Ren Tin had such fun building their house together. Each would fly off into the woods, and search for just the right twig, or leaf that they thought would work. Then they would weave it into the floor of their house, and then the walls, and roof. They worked very hard in the springtime to make their house. And when it was completed, they were very happy. They stood out on a branch in front of their new house, and sang, and sang, and sang. They were very happy. Ren Tin looked at the new house and was surprised at what a good job they had done. He and Wendy had never built a house before, so this was their very first one, and it was perfect. The front door was just big enough for them to squeeze through to get inside. This was very important because it wouldn't let bad birds or other animals get inside. The front door was just too small for anyone else. So that night, Ren Tin went out and found a very fine dinner. It was a big old wiggly worm. But it was a special worm that Wendy liked the most. Ren Tin brought it home, and he was so nice to Wendy that he fed her bites of dinner with his own little beak. Wendy cooed and chirped. It was so tasty and it made her little tummy feel real warm and full. But you know what else? Her little tummy had something else making it feel full. Suddenly, just as Wendy and Ren Tin were about to settle down for the night in their new house with all of Wendy's final touches that made it feel so warm and safe, she felt her house begin to move. Slowly at first, but then it began to move more and more from side to side and up and down. At first, she didn't know what was happening. It was the wind blowing hard against the tree and making the branches where Wendy's house was built move back and forth. Then before she could get used to her house bouncing up and down, came a huge sound. The sky began to sparkle and light up like a fireworks show, and the thunder kept going very loud. Wendy pressed herself deeper into her little home and snuggled up tightly beside Ren Tin. She tried to shut out the sound of the thunder, but she could see the flashes of lightning through the opening of her front door. Then she heard the water begin to come down. It pounded against her little house and occasionally a little bit splashed off a branch, but it didn't come through the front door. It boomed, and flashed, and rained, and rained. But her beautiful new home held up against the storm. Wendy and Ren Tin were safe and dry and warm inside their little home while the storm boomed, and banged, and blew, and rained, and spewed outside. And then as quickly as it started, the storm became quiet. The wind quit blowing, and her house became steady again. The lightning also quit and soon the clouds began to disappear. Wendy could see through the front door, and see it was starting to get light in the sky through the tree where they lived. And a magic rainbow appeared. It was a pretty sight and Wendy felt very happy. She would never be afraid of a storm again. After the storm, Wendy was finally snuggling down for the night. She felt something happen, and then again, and again, and again. She moved around and now could see 4 of the prettiest little brown and white eggs she had ever seen. She pressed her beak against Ren Tin Tin's side to wake him up. She chirped at him to tell him to look. Come look. Ren Tin Tin was delighted to see the little eggs. He knew all of their hard work was now worth it, and he fell back asleep feeling pretty good about himself and Wendy. Morning came, and the sky was beautiful and clear. Ren Tin Tin stepped out on their front porch to take in the sights and smells of the morning. The water was still on the leaves from the rain, and he took a little of it in his beak and passed it back to Wendy, who was sitting smartly on her 4 little eggs to keep them warm and safe. She chirped her thank you for the water, and Ren Tin Tin broke into a beautiful song to announce to his friends and neighbors that they were going to have some new baby wrens. Ren Tin Tin also knew that this was not the end of his job. Now he had to go out and do both his job and Wendy's, because she had to stay at home to keep the 4 little eggs warm and safe. It was going to be a lot of work, but he didn't mind. He was very unselfish, and he would do a good job to find food and water for Wendy and himself. So Ren Tin Tin bid a quick goodbye to Wendy, and with a flip of his wings, he flew off to do his job. The days passed slowly for Wendy. She was used to being outside and flying all over. She loved to fly, and she could do it so beautifully. She could zip like a flash to the tallest of trees, and sit in the top of their branches, and sing her heart out. Normally, she would fly off to do her work, and Ren Tin Tin would fly off to do his. Then in the evening, after they had worked, they wouldn't know where the other one had gone. So each would go up in a high tree and begin singing their special song and listen for the other one to sing back to them. Finally, they would hear each other and fly to meet each other and snuggle together for the night. But now she was not able to do any of this. She had her eggs to warm and protect, so she couldn't go anywhere. She had to wait for Ren Tin Tin to come back from time to time to bring her a bite to eat. She was very proud of Ren Tin Tin. He was so handsome and so sweet to her, and he was doing such a good job of taking care of her while she sat on her eggs. She loved him very much. Then one afternoon, Wendy was sitting on her eggs and she became very sleepy. It was very warm outside and Ren Tin Tin had just left after bringing her summer lunch. So Wendy felt her eyes begin to close and she let out a little sigh in her chest and quickly fell sound asleep. But not for long. All of a sudden she heard the most awful sound right outside her little home. Wendy's heart jumped into her throat and began to beat very fast. It was so loud and sounded very mean. She pushed herself further back in the nest to get her and her eggs as far from the front door as possible. Her worst fears were coming true. She knew exactly who was making that awful noise. She remembered the stories she had heard growing up about the mean old crow who would attack their houses and try to take their little baby eggs away. Well, this mean old crow would have a fight on his hands, thought Wendy. Then she realized how very big he was and how tiny and little she was. Crows would even pick on dogs. This scared her even more. What was she going to do? So she decided to yell at him to go away. So that she did, with her biggest and strongest voice ever. Wendy was a tiny little bird, but wrens have huge voices. In fact, their voices were much bigger than birds that were even 10 times bigger than the moo. Wendy had told Ren Tin Tin about one time when she was sitting up in this tall tree when this huge hawk flew into the same tree and landed on another branch. At first she was afraid, but then she remembered that hawks wouldn't bother wrens. She was so quick that she could easily fly away from him. But then she said that another bird, a mockingbird, came flying up and just for fun, he would fly around the hawk and try to peck him. Well, this made the hawk very mad because Mr. Mockingbird was so quick. Then the hawk yelled at Mr. Mockingbird, but his voice was very tiny. He went, "Eek eek." Wendy looked at this big bird with such a tiny voice and she got tickled. She began to giggle and giggle until she nearly fell out of the tree. She remembered her father's voice, and even though he wasn't as big as the hawk's feet, He could shake the roof with his big giant voice. Anyway, Hawk gave Wendy a hard look for laughing at him, so she decided she better take her giggles and fly somewhere else, which she did. So now, Wendy sang out with her biggest voice to tell that crow to get out of here. It was so loud that it even surprised Wendy. And it surprised the crow too. He jumped off the branch, he was so surprised. He flew around the tree for a minute while he tried to figure out who could make so much noise. Then he flew right back to Wendy's house and like a bully, began to caw again. Wendy tried yelling at him again, but this time he wasn't surprised. Now Wendy was really scared, because suddenly the front door was becoming dark as that bad crow came closer and closer. Wendy knew that he couldn't get in the front door, because he was much too big. But that didn't stop him from trying. And his beak was small enough to get inside. It was a long sharp beak and Wendy could see it start coming in through the opening in her front door. She didn't know if it was long enough to reach her and her baby eggs, but she didn't want to risk it, so she flew as hard as she could at the front door and pecked as hard as she could at Bad Crow's face. Well, once again, this surprised Bad Crow so much that he jumped backwards and fell off the limb. But once again, he flew around the tree while he figured out what he would do next. Sure enough, he flew right back to Wendy's front porch. And this time he was not going to be surprised by anything this little bird might do. He was going to peck at her house until he tore it down. He was mad. He raised his head and with all his might, he pecked hard at the front door. Inside Wendy jumped, because it sounded almost as loud as the thunder during the storm. The little house shook from the hard blow. But the house didn't break. So the crow raised his head and crashed his beak against the house again. The poor little house shook so hard that Wendy was afraid that it couldn't hold up against Bad Crow, who was so mean and so strong. All of a sudden, she heard a melody of songs from somewhere in the tree outside her house. She had heard that song before, and knew that it was Mr. and Mrs. Mockingbird, who lived in the next tree from theirs. Then she heard a sound that was the same sound her wings made when she would fly around the neighborhood, swish, 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 and she heard the crow say caw. And then eek, eek. She quickly went to the front door and peeked out. To her surprise, there were Mr. and Mrs. Mockingbird swooping and diving all around that Bad Crow. When he was watching one from the front, the other would swoop behind and give him a good peck on the back of his mean old head. He would let out an eek and jump from front to back. But Mr. and Mrs. Mockingbird were way too fast for him, and he couldn't stop them no matter how much he jumped every which way. Wendy began to giggle and then burst out laughing and then started giggling again. All her fears were gone now, and it felt so good to have the mockingbirds chasing this big bully. That old crow finally had enough and he took off as fast and hard as he could. But the mockingbirds kept chasing him all the way, until they all went out of sight. When Rin Tin Tin came home that evening with their dinner, Wendy was too excited to eat at first. She was talking so fast, Rin Tin Tin had to make her sit down and start from the beginning. She started telling Rin Tin Tin about how afraid she was, and how that crow had tried to tear down their house. And just when she thought she didn't have a chance, the mockingbirds came and rescued her. Tears came to her eyes when she told Rin Tin Tin how awful it had been. Then when she started telling him about how the mockingbirds pecked Crow on the back of his mean old head and how he went eek and jumped every which way, she started to giggle once again, and the more she told him, the more she giggled. Finally, Rin Tin Tin began to giggle and then began laughing out loud. He told Wendy how proud he was of her courage, and how she had fought off that Bad Crow for so long. He said he thought her loud voice is what brought Mr. and Mrs. Mockingbird to her rescue. They would have to think of a way to bring a special thank you to the mockingbirds. The next day, Rin Tin Tin got up as usual to fetch some water for Wendy. But today, he told Wendy he wanted to do something a little different. Today, he said, "I will sit on the eggs and let you go off to work. and use your wings again to fly like you like to do so much. Plus, he told her that he was worried that mean old crow might come back, and he wanted to give him a piece of his mind. With that, Ren Tin Tin puffed out his chest and let out a big song. Wendy was really excited about getting to fly out for a while today. That would be a big treat. She was really tired of sitting here on the nest all day, every day. But she wanted to be sure that Ren Tin Tin knew what he was doing, so she questioned him. Are you sure? You know it gets very boring just sitting here on those baby eggs. Plus, you are the man around here and this is a job for a woman. But Ren Tin Tin told her, you do a good job to go and find food, just as well as I can. And I don't think of this as a woman's job. It is a good job for anyone to sit on these baby eggs. So with that, Wendy gave him a peck on his beak, and away she flew. Wee, she sang as she soared up above the trees, and then as she swooped all the way down, just above the ground, and then soared up in the trees again, and again. Finally, she was almost out of breath, so she sat on a limb to rest. Then she realized that she needed to get started on the day's work, and find some food for Ren Tin Tin and herself. Meanwhile, Ren Tin Tin was sitting comfortably on the baby eggs in the nest. It was very quiet and he began to feel sleepy. His head bobbed forward as he was just about to fall asleep. Then he felt something happening underneath him. At first he thought it might be the wind starting up again, and rocking the house. But then he realized it was just a small movement in the nest. He got up to look and sure enough, the baby eggs were starting to move. He quickly got back on top of the eggs and began thinking, oh my goodness. I hope Wendy gets home soon. This is more than I bargained for, and I sure don't want our babies to come without her here to take care of them. So he began to sing a song very softly, hoping the babies could hear him through the shell of their egg and maybe quiet down and wait. This seemed to work for a while, but not too much later, he could feel them stirring again. He knew there wasn't anything he could do to keep them quiet, so he just kept wishing, and wishing that Wendy would show up. All of a sudden, he felt one of the eggs really start to move and roll over and almost jump up and down. Wendy, Wendy, he began to sing out. He got off the nest to look at what was happening with the eggs, and just then he saw a big crack in one of the eggs. Oh my goodness! He exclaimed. What am I going to do now? These babies need their mother. Just in the nick of time, Wendy swooped onto the front porch and burst through the front door. Oh Wendy, Ren Tin Tin said. Am I glad to see you. Come see what's happening. Wendy rushed to the nest just in time to see a tiny beak poke out of the shell. Then the shell started breaking apart and she could see her little baby wren inside. He was all wet like he had been out in the rain. But Wendy knew that was normal. His little eyes were closed and he couldn't really stand up. As Wendy was pushing around on him with her beak, more action started with the other eggs, and within a few minutes, she was looking at 2 more wren babies. She nuzzled the 3 little chicks under her wing and looked at the 4th egg. Nothing was happening. She was a little bit puzzled, but she knew what she had to do, and so she pushed the egg up under her to keep it warm, and continued to look after the other 3 babies. Finally, just before dawn the next morning, she felt the 4th egg start to move under her. She waited and waited, and then the 4th egg started bumping around. She watched as a tiny beak broke through the shell and continued to break the shell until there he was, her 4th little baby chick. By now the other babies had wakened and they let the world know they had arrived. They opened their little beaks wide and began to cry and yell at the top of their voices. Screech, 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 was their demanding cry. Ren Tin Tin jumped out of bed and headed out to get some water. This just made the babies that much hungrier, it seemed, and they got louder and louder. So Ren Tin Tin quickly flew out to get the first thing he could find. He could hear the babies as he flew all over the woods. Hurry, he told himself, and sure enough he found a nice juicy breakfast for the family. He rushed back to the nest. He and Wren began feeding the starving baby wrens. Baby number 4 patiently waited until he felt his mother putting the food in his mouth. One by one, they finally quieted down. "Phew," said Ren Tin Tin. "This is sure a noisy bunch of children. It made my ears hurt, they were so loud." "Get used to it," Wendy said, "because it's going to be like that every day until they get a little older." Sure enough, in just a few hours, the babies began to screech again and again. Ren Tin Tin stayed busy, running back and forth for more food. He didn't get much sleep for the next several days. "Phew," he said, "this is a big job trying to raise a family. Now I know why my parents used to tell me how much I could eat when I was a baby. These kids can really eat." Finally, the baby wren's eyes were open and they could see. They could also wobble around a bit on their shaky little legs. They even had a little bit of fuzzy feathers growing. And they were hungrier than ever. Now, Ren Tin Tin and Wendy both flew out of their home to find food for this bunch. The kids grew bigger and bigger every day. Wendy told Ren Tin Tin that it was time for them to name the babies. They thought, and thought, and thought. Finally, Wendy said, "I will name the girl babies, and you can name the boy babies." Ren Tin Tin agreed. So Wendy named the first girl, Wendy Wren, and the second girl, Rhonda Wren. Ren Tin Tin named the boys Tinny Wren and Rusty Wren. Tinny was the first of the Wren babies, and Rusty was the last of the babies to come out of the shell. He was still the smallest, but he was the loudest of them all. A few days later, Ren Tin Tin said that instead of naming him Rusty, he should have named him Screech, and they all laughed. So Ren Tin Tin, Wendy, Rennie, Rhonda, Tinny, and Rusty all lived in their little home together as the young ones grew bigger and bigger and feathery. Wendy tried to teach the kids how to peck on the twigs that were part of their home. She told them they would need to know how to peck at things to find food once they were big enough, and she wanted them to make their beaks stronger and stronger. Now it was getting time to teach them to start to hunt for food on their own. But first, they would need to learn how to fly. So Wendy had each of them stand on the front edge of their home and flap their wings over and over again. But Rusty was still smaller and just didn't seem to be able to get his wings flapping like the others. But they kept working on this every day, and Wendy and Ren Tin Tin said that the house was too small for all of them, and it was time to fly away to find a new home. It was a pretty day, with lots of sunshine, and the trees were all green, and everything was just right for their next adventure. Ren Tin Tin flew off the front porch and swooped around to show the kids how to turn and how to go up and down. Then Wendy nudged Tinny with her beak toward the porch, and finally nudged him off the branch into the air. Tinny stretched his wings out as far as they could go, and then started flapping them as hard as he could. "Wow," he thought as he realized he was flying. "This is fun," he shouted back at the others. Wendy nudged each of the girls to the front, and off the branch, into the air. Just like Tinny, they stretched and flapped until they started to know how to fly. "Wow, this is fun," they both said. Finally Wendy nudged Rusty to the edge. Rusty looked down and said, "Oh, it's a long way down and I'm scared." Wendy encouraged him, and said he could do it, and with that nudged him into the air. Rusty started dropping toward the ground. Ren Tin Tin flew back toward him, and Wendy watched as her little boy was falling, and her heart started beating fast. "Stretch out your wings, Rusty," Ren Tin Tin shouted. Then Rusty stretched his wings and suddenly he quit falling so fast. "Flap your wings, Rusty," Ren Tin Tin shouted again. Flap, 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 and all of a sudden Rusty was not falling anymore. By now, the other kids had landed on a branch nearby, and were watching Rusty try to fly. He was up, he was down, he was sideways, and every which way. But it looked like he could make it. Then the other kids started laughing at the crazy way that Rusty was flying, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. Suddenly, things turned worse again. Rusty's wings were getting tired and he couldn't make it to the branch where the others were sitting. Rusty saw this big brown patch below him, and told himself he had to make it to that patch. So with all his best effort and strength he flapped himself to the patch and flopped right onto it. "What in the world?" Farmer Jones exclaimed as he pulled his big straw hat off his head. "What hit me?" he asked. Lo and behold, sitting on top of his hat was this tiny little wren. "Well, my goodness! What do we have here?" exclaimed Farmer Jones with surprise. Rusty looked at Farmer Jones and Farmer Jones looked at Rusty. "Are you all right, little fellow?" asked Farmer Jones. Of course Rusty didn't have any idea what he said. Rusty started to become afraid of this big animal that was under the brown patch. Farmer Jones reached a finger to try to touch Rusty's little brown head, but Rusty was afraid he was going to hurt him, so he opened his beak and grabbed hold onto Farmer Jones's finger. Of course it didn't hurt, and Farmer Jones just laughed and told Rusty he wasn't going to hurt him. Now the whole family was sitting in the branch above watching all of this, and afraid for Rusty. So they sat and worried and worried. But then Farmer Jones picked up Rusty very gently and let him stand up on a finger of his other hand. Then Farmer Jones tossed his hand upward and sent Rusty back into the air. Rusty got his strength back and started flapping like crazy until he was flying well enough to get to the branch with his mum and dad and sisters and brother. "Oh, that was an adventure," he told the others. And they all agreed and started to giggle and finally to laugh as hard as they could at the way Rusty was sitting on the branch. So, Wendy said she knew a place where they could spend the night, and that Rin Tin Tin, and she would teach them how to look for food and help them get better at flying. All of a sudden, the kids realized how all of this activity had made them hungrier than ever before in their lives and they were ready to get going. So with Rin Tin Tin leading, one by one, they took off to more and more adventures in the days to come. Wendy stayed until the last. She looked back at their pretty little home that she and Rin Tin Tin had built, and thought about how much fun that had been. She remembered how she and Rin Tin Tin would sing to each other at the end of the day. She remembered how the storm had scared her. Most of all she remembered how it was to raise these little baby wrens, who were now getting ready to go off on a life of their own. A tear came to her eye as she took a last look at their home. Then she flapped her wings and left the branch to follow the family. Then a thought came to her. Next spring, she and Rin Tin Tin would return here again and rebuild their little home stronger and prettier than ever before. Then maybe they could have some more little wren babies like Tinny, Rhonda, Rennie, and Rusty. That made her happy as she flew to catch up with the family. Wendy yelled to her family, "Hey, wait for me." The end.